Tonight, we will journey into the world of feudal Japan to explore the silk, the sweat, and the subtle power games that define the life of a concubine. Imagine being trained for your entire existence to master the fine art of walking, of sighing, and of seducing a powerful lord with nothing more than the exact angle of your wrist. So, as we begin, find a comfortable position. You may wish to dim the lights and allow the soft sounds around you to create a gentle background hum as we ease into our story together. Dawn arrives with the subtlety of a polite knock. There are no roosters, no fanfare, just the faint glow of light through rice paper doors and the soft shuffle of servants' feet, pretending they are not judging your posture on the futon. You lie perfectly still, not because you are rested, but because any abrupt movement might undo your carefully crafted image of grace and mystery. In truth, your back hurts, your hair is flattened on one side, and you have had a dream involving eels that you would rather not analyze. But none of that matters now. This is the first scene of the day's performance. You are both the star and the stage decoration. Your attendants enter the room in hushed tones, bowing so low that you briefly consider stepping over them. A warm basin of water is set before you, as if to say, "Here is your dignity. Now please scrub behind your ears." They begin their work, cleansing and brushing, preparing you to look less like someone who has just woken up and more like a porcelain enigma. Your face is washed gently, and your hair is brushed with reverence. Not because they love you, but because they have seen what happens to the women of the court who show up with frizz. Meanwhile, you maintain the correct expression. Serene, detached, and only mildly annoyed. You remain silent, because heaven forbid a concubine should speak before she has been powdered. You glance at your reflection in a polished bronze mirror. You look like someone who has opinions but is paid not to share them. Perfect. From beyond the sliding screen, you can hear the muffled laughter of the Daimyo, who apparently has a great deal of energy this morning. That is either a promising sign or a warning. You make a mental note to avoid making direct eye contact with his favorite concubine until after the morning tea. You rise from the futon like a swan emerging from the fog, assuming that the swan also has slightly numb legs and a tight obi waiting for it in its near future. Your sleeves are laid out, the incense has been lit. The illusion begins. And as you stretch your shoulders just slightly, you whisper the universal mantra of women everywhere. Here we go again. Now that you are upright and pretending that you did not sleep on your neck the wrong way, it is time for your makeup, or as it is known in the concubine industry, a form of historical self-erasure with a side of toxins. Step 1 is the white powder, which is made from crushed rice and, in some cases, enough lead to qualify as a building material. Your attendant starts to pat it onto your face as if she were trying to cover up a crime scene. The goal is to eliminate all signs of life. If your skin tone resembles anything that is found in nature, you are doing it wrong. Next comes your neck and your chest, because heaven forbid the daimyo should glimpse a patch of skin that does not look as though it has been painted on by a ghost. You sit still while they go to town with the powder puff, occasionally resisting the urge to sneeze and ruin your new identity. Then come the eyebrows. Your own are irrelevant. They are painted over and then redrawn several centimeters too high, creating a look that says, "I am surprised by everything and am also emotionally unavailable." In theory, it is considered to be an alluring look. Now for the lips. You would think that they would be fully painted, but no, just a dainty little red blob in the very middle. It is supposed to look demure, but instead, it looks as though you have just kissed a plum and then run away. But you nod your head in approval anyway, because this is how tradition works. If it feels strange and is mildly unflattering, you are probably doing it right. And finally, the piece de resistance, the blackening of the teeth. Yes, really, a sticky iron paste is carefully brushed onto your teeth, making your smile look as though it has been censored. Supposedly, this is meant to signal that you are off limits. In practice, it only confuses people and gives you one more reason not to grin too often. Throughout this whole ordeal, you sit like a statue that is being vandalized by a very polite team of artists. You do not move, you do not comment, and you certainly do not ask, "Is this really necessary?" The answer is always yes, not because it makes any sense, but because it has been done this way for centuries, and no one wants to be the first one to blink. By the end of it all, you look like a painting that has come to life, if that painting had been done by someone who hated skin and loved drama. After being powdered into an emotionally distant kabuki mask, it is time to get dressed, and by dressed, we do not mean slipping into something comfortable. We mean willingly entering a fabric-based endurance challenge. Step 1 is the underlayers. These are the breathable cotton pieces that are meant to stop your fancier garments from fusing with your very soul during the summer months. They do not succeed in this, but at least they give you the illusion of ventilation. Next come the inner robes, which are decorative, symbolic, and entirely unnecessary, except for the fact that they are absolutely required. Each one must be put on in the correct order, or your social status will drop faster than a clumsy geisha on a patch of ice. The color combinations are entirely coded. For example, a dark red over a pale green means that you are elegant but mysterious, while a white over a gold says, "Please do not talk to me before tea." Then there is the outer kimono, which is heavier, shinier, and much less forgiving. By now, your sleeves are long enough to smother a rival concubine if needed, which, incidentally, is why no one stands too close to you during your morning preparations. And finally, there is the obi, the sash that ties it all together and quietly tries to murder your spine. It is pulled tight enough to remind you that you are not allowed to breathe freely until the sun sets. A well-tied obi can say many things. It can speak of refinement, of poise, and of the quiet desperation of someone who is just one sneeze away from a full collapse. You do not dress yourself, of course. You stand perfectly still while two attendants wrap you, fold you, tug you, and adjust you, as if they were trying to make origami out of a human being. They do not speak. They just occasionally grunt when something does not lie flat. That grunt means that you should hold your arms up higher. You learn the language. By the time they are finished, you have lost all feeling in your ribs, but you look magnificent, like a walking imperial scroll with passive-aggressive eyes. And the real kicker is that this is your daily outfit. You do not even have any plans for the day. You might just sit in the garden, pretending to read poetry all day long, but you must look as though you are ready for a royal portrait or a spontaneous seduction, which, to be fair, is not off the table. You are now fully dressed, which is an impressive feat, considering that you are wearing more fabric than a small pavilion tent. It is time for breakfast, or as it is known in concubine circles, an exercise in restraint, posture, and not accidentally dipping your sleeve into the miso soup. You are seated on a cushion with your legs tucked properly beneath you, which is a charming position if you are a folding fan, but a complete nightmare if you have knees. A tray is placed in front of you, precisely arranged with a bowl of rice, a sliver of grilled fish, 3 pickled vegetables, and a bowl of miso soup that looks as though it is judging you. The portions are small because you are not here to bulk up. You are here to appear ethereal and faintly underfed, just as all good romantic metaphors do. Your job is to consume just enough to avoid collapsing, but not so much as to imply that you actually enjoy food. If you chew too enthusiastically, someone will raise an eyebrow. If you ask for a second helping, someone will raise a scroll. Eating is done in complete silence. There is no slurping, no sighing, and definitely no contorting of your face. Even if the pickled plum has just sucker-punched your taste buds. Everything must be done with grace. A ballet of chopsticks and disappointment. Your kimono sleeves are enormous, so each bite that you take involves a level of spatial awareness that is usually reserved for swordplay. You develop certain techniques. You tuck the sleeve under your forearm, you lean slightly to the side, and you pray that it does not drag through the soup and send a wave of fermented tofu across the tatami mat. All the while, your attendants are hovering quietly nearby. They will not say anything, but they are watching, not in a creepy way, but more in a, "We will be gossiping about this later" way. Every blink is noted, and every single grain of rice that you miss is mentally cataloged under the heading of mild embarrassment. You finish your meal, you bow lightly, and you set your chopsticks down with the kind of reverence that is usually reserved for sacred relics. Breakfast is now complete. Was it satisfying? Emotionally, no. Nutritionally, questionable. But spiritually, you feel lighter. That could be due to the food, or it could be due to the fact that your obi is slowly cutting off the circulation to your spine. Either way, you are now ready for the next part of your day, which, spoiler alert, mostly just involves waiting. Now that you have been powdered, robed, and fed something that is roughly the size of a toddler's snack, it is time for the concubine's primary daily task: waiting. But this is not just any kind of waiting. It is elegant waiting. It is a waiting that whispers, "Yes, I am entirely free this afternoon," but in a very powerful way. You are not allowed to roam the estate freely, heavens no, because that is how scandals happen. Instead, you sit in your designated space. A tastefully minimal garden room with a painted screen, a bonsai tree, and a strategically placed view of a koi pond that has not done anything interesting since last autumn. You sit, you wait, and occasionally you adjust your posture so that it looks as though you are contemplating eternity and not as though you are fighting off a leg cramp. You are not allowed to look impatient. That is for merchants and for wives. Concubines are supposed to wait as if they are doing you a favor. This waiting could last for 10 minutes, or it could last for 5 hours. The daimyo may summon you, or he may not. He might be with another woman, or he might be reading war poetry, or he might just be napping with his head on a very expensive pillow. The point is, you will find out when someone tells you that you are needed, or when they do not. To pass the time, you might compose a poem, not a particularly good one, just something that is vaguely sad about plum blossoms and unspoken longing. That is the genre you are aiming for. You get bonus points if no one can tell who the poem is actually about. You could also play a shamisen softly, but not too joyfully, as no one likes a concubine who seems to be too excited. Of course, the other women are waiting too, sometimes within your sight, and sometimes just out of your earshot. It is a silent competition. Who looks the most serene, who has adjusted her robe just right, and who has caught the eye of the messenger who is delivering tea to the daimyo's quarters. It is a game of chess that is played with glances, with posture, and with whether or not your obi is tied fashionably off-center. And the trickiest part of it all? Looking as though you are not waiting at all. You must appear as though your entire sense of self-worth does not hang on the possibility of being summoned for the night, which, of course, it absolutely does. But you are a professional. You sigh quietly, beautifully, and you look off into the distance, preferably towards something poetic, like a falling leaf or a koi that looks just as bored as you are. If the morning was all about preparation, then the afternoon is all about positioning. And we are not talking about yoga here. This is a game of courtly social strategy, dressed up in floral silk and scented with plum blossom oil. By now, the other concubines are all fully assembled. You exchange nods, shallow bows, and smiles that may look warm but could probably cut through glass. This is not friendship. It is veiled espionage. Everyone is watching, everyone is listening, and everyone is very quietly trying to destroy each other's reputations without ever having to raise their voices. The room is calm, the tension is floral, and the topics of conversation are all trivial by design. Lady Aiko's calligraphy has improved so much. Someone might say, the translation of this is, she used to write like a drunken monk, or the daimyo seemed to be very peaceful this morning. The translation of this is, he did not summon you, did he? And of course, there is the classic, you look so radiant today, which actually means, you look less dead than you usually do, so congratulations. Compliments are like verbal daggers that are sheathed in politeness. The sharper the smile, the more likely it is that you are being insulted. A well-timed observation about someone's kimono being bravely modern can spark a week-long existential crisis. You have to navigate all of this with grace, or at least you have to pretend to. You smile gently, you tilt your head when you are listening, and you appear to be impressed by someone's haiku, even though it was clearly plagiarized from a folding screen. Then comes the moment when someone mentions the daimyo. Maybe he was seen walking near the pond. Maybe he paused to examine a fan that one of the other concubines had left out by accident. The room becomes still, but in a casual way, as if no one is definitely panicking on the inside. This is when the performance deepens. You must seem to be interested in him, but not too interested. You must appear confident, but not cocky. You must be available, but also untouched. It is like trying to be a dessert that everyone wants, but that no one is quite sure is safe to eat. And through it all, you keep your voice soft, your posture impeccable, and your insults indirect. This is how status is gained in this world. Not through war, but through whispers. And if you are able to leave the room with even one of your rivals doubting her choice of sleeve, her poem, or her scent, then you have done well for the day. You have not been summoned yet, but hope springs eternal, and it also sweats discreetly under 12 layers of silk. So, as the sun crawls past its highest point in the sky, and you have survived another round of eye contact diplomacy, it is time for your just in case bath. It is not mandatory, but it is highly recommended, in the same way that it is recommended that you do not smell of anxiety and pickled radish when you are entering a daimyo's private chamber. The bathhouse is quiet, it is steamy, and it is filled with the faint scent of yuzu peels and a great deal of pressure. You undress with the help of your attendant, because most concubines cannot single-handedly escape from the labyrinth of ties, folds, knots, and moral restrictions that come with wearing a formal kimono. Once you are disrobed, and you are finally free from the human upholstery, you step into the hot water. For a brief moment, you are no one. Not a symbol, not a part of a strategy, just a sweaty woman in a tub who is wondering if she has shaved her legs evenly enough for an aristocrat who has questionable eyesight. You scrub yourself, but not too aggressively. There is a certain technique to this. You want to be clean, but not desperate. A light scent is then applied, nothing too floral. You are not trying to smell like a geisha with something to prove, just alluring enough to imply that you own your own fan. Your hair is re-oiled, your skin is dusted, and your feet are checked for any calluses, because yes, even your heels must be ready for an inspection by men who have not clipped their own toenails since the last rice harvest. And all of this might be for nothing. You may not be called upon tonight. You may have to go back to your quarters and reapply all of your powder, just so you can sit perfectly still while you compose some more emotionally vague poetry about ducks. But if he does summon you and you show up smelling of stress and raw tofu, well, that would be scandalous. So you bathe, you prepare, and you become soft and subtle and ever so mildly flammable with incense oil, because being ready is all a part of the game, even if the invitation never arrives. And besides, the best revenge on the other concubines is to look better than they do, without even trying. It does not happen with the sound of trumpets. There is no scroll that is unrolled by a herald, and there is no dramatic striking of a gong. The summons, when it finally comes, arrives in the same way that most terrifying things do in high society. Politely. There is a soft knock on your door, a bowed messenger, and a single phrase. His lordship requests your presence. The translation of this is, you have been chosen. It also means that you have 20 minutes to mentally prepare yourself, to repowder your face, and to spiritually detach yourself from the situation. Your attendants spring into action. You, meanwhile, have to attempt to look neither smug nor nauseous. After all, this is a compliment, possibly. It could mean that he favors you, or it could mean that his favorite concubine is currently annoyed with him and that you are just the understudy. Either way, tonight you are on the stage. First comes the reapplication of your makeup. A fresh layer of powder to mask your existential dread. A tiny touch of rouge to say, I am alive, but also mysterious. And a careful adjustment of your outer kimono. You switch to the more expensive one, the one that has cranes embroidered on it in flight, because nothing says, I am worth undressing slowly, quite like symbolic birds that are stitched in gold thread. Next is your hair. It is already perfect, but you go over it again just in case. You add a comb, one that is not too flashy, and you dab a little extra yuzu oil behind your ears. You now smell of restraint and citrus-scented ambition. As you walk towards his private chambers, the hallway seems to stretch on endlessly. Every step that you take is measured, not too fast and not too eager. You are a river, not a waterfall. Behind their closed doors, your rival concubines are pretending not to notice, but they do. Oh, they most certainly do. You reach the inner room and a screen is slid open. You bow deeply and elegantly. You are not nervous, just incredibly aware of every inch of your body and of whether or not your lips are smudged. He greets you or he does not. Either way, you just smile faintly. You are now in character. A favorite, a diversion, a muse for the evening. No one ever says, that is not how this works. You are here because you were chosen, and for the next few hours you must be art, warmth, mystery, and convenience. And maybe, just maybe, you will be unforgettable. But let us not get too cocky just yet. There is still tea to be poured. Despite what the gossiping ladies of the court might say, a concubine's evening with the daimyo does not start with the act of disrobing. It starts with a ritual, specifically a slow and fragrant descent into a flirtation that is so formal it might be mistaken for a tea ceremony with a great deal of unresolved tension. You sit down, not too close, not yet. There is a lacquered table between you, a pot of sake that is warming silently, and enough eye contact to fuel an entire anthology of haikus. He pours you a cup. That is your cue. You sip it slowly, as if it is not just fermented rice, but a coded invitation to be charming. The compliments begin, going both ways. His robe is magnificent. Your hair is exquisite. No one ever mentions the fact that you both know exactly how this night is going to end, but it is all a part of the charm to pretend otherwise. The conversation drifts from one topic to another. Poetry, dreams, and sometimes a story about a hawk that he once saw that looked just like destiny. You nod, looking intrigued, and not just because his hand is inching ever closer to yours. You have heard the hawk story 3 times before, but that is not the point. The point is that tonight you are the muse, even if you are also a well-trained performer. There might be music, perhaps a soft melody that is being played on the shamisen, not by you, of course. You are too busy holding the room's attention like a delicate fan, open, mysterious, and possibly with some sharp edges. Now comes the touch, light at first and very measured. He is testing the waters, or perhaps just reminding himself of which concubine you are. You respond accordingly, with just enough to signal your interest, but never so much as to appear enthusiastic. Remember, mystery is sexy. Desperation is not. The conversation has now ended with the poetry. This is all about presence. You are both now in character. He is the powerful lord, and you are the willing flower who has conveniently just bloomed tonight. You move in the way that you were taught, gracefully, precisely, as if you had been choreographed by someone who has never actually been in love but has read a lot of poetry about it. You make all the right sounds at all the right times, not too loud and not too silent, just enough to let him know that he is doing well, even if you are mentally reorganizing your poetry scrolls in your head. Eventually, it all comes to an end, either in a triumph or in what you will later refer to as a gentle fade out. He may say something or he may not. You smile either way. You rise, you redress yourself, and you bow carefully, hiding the pins that have left indentations in your scalp and the cramp that started somewhere in Act 2. And then you leave. You do not look back. You do not ask how it was for him. You do not ask if he remembers your name, because this was not for connection. This was for position. And tonight you had it. For now, he is asleep, sprawled out across the futon like a man who has just conquered a province. And not, say, like someone who has fallen asleep immediately after a moderate amount of effort. You lie there beside him with your eyes open, your spine straight, and your mind racing. Not because you are overwhelmed with emotion, but because this part, the afterglow, is where the real mental gymnastics begin. Did you do well? Was your hair still in place? Did he like the part where you tilted your head just so? Should you have moaned a bit more? Or was that one breath that you took just a little too loud? These are the questions that you will not ask out loud, but that you will obsessively review in your mind, like a general who is analyzing his battlefield losses. You cannot move just yet. Leaving too soon would seem cold, but staying for too long would seem clingy. So you just lie there, watching the ceiling, counting the bamboo slats, and wondering if the other concubines are still awake. They probably are. They can smell a summoning like a wolf can smell fear. The silence is heavy, but not unpleasant, just full of unsaid things, of unasked questions, and of the faint hope that you have earned yourself a slightly better breakfast tray for tomorrow morning. He might mumble something in his sleep, a compliment or a name, hopefully yours. You just nod in the dark, even if he is already snoring like a man who has never had to sleep with his dignity folded up inside his obi. Eventually, you rise quietly. The graceful post-coital exit is a very delicate thing. You gather your robe, you tie your sash, and you straighten your hair just enough to look like a woman who is glowing from a sense of mystery, and not from sweat. There is no one in the corridor, but you walk as if they are all watching you, because in this place they always are. Your footsteps are soft, your face is neutral, and your heart is tucked away, locked up behind your very best performance yet. You return to your quarters, and you find that someone has already lit the lamp for you. The tea is warm. You drink it without really tasting it. You sit down all alone, and only then do you finally exhale. You do not know if tonight meant anything. You do not know if he will remember it or you tomorrow. But at the very least, you know this: you were chosen. And in this world, that is a form of currency, even if it only lasts until the sun rises. You wake up early again, not because you are refreshed, but because concubines do not get to sleep in. That is a luxury that is reserved for wives, or for men, or for mythical creatures who have no political rivals. The futon that you fell into last night now feels smaller, or maybe you are just more aware of how little space you actually occupy in the palace's hierarchy. You are a decorative presence that is wrapped in brocade and in tightly controlled expectations. Your attendants enter your room, their eyes politely avoiding yours. No one says anything about where you were last night, but they all know. The scent of incense still lingers faintly on your skin, and your hair is only slightly messier than the standard, unapproachable cloud of perfection. They begin the process all over again. The powder, the comb, the folding of the robes, the reconstruction of the masterpiece that is your public face. It is remarkably similar to yesterday's masterpiece, with the only real difference being your increased awareness of just how exhausting beauty actually is. The silence between you and your attendants is a companionable one, though it is also tinged with a quiet sense of judgment. One of them might cough ever so slightly. Another might casually mention that Lady Ko received a rare silk comb this morning. You just nod. The game is back on. There is no debriefing, no recap of the night's events. You do not tell anyone that the Daimyo smelled faintly of plum wine, or that he said something vaguely poetic before he fell asleep in the middle of a sentence. And you certainly do not mention that you are now second-guessing every single moment of eye contact that you made. That would be unseemly. Instead, you just sit once again in your chamber, composed, refined, and preparing for another day of passive warfare that is disguised as critiques of floral arrangements and the practicing of the shamisen. You sip your tea. You write half of a poem. You stare at a crane that is outside your window, and you wonder what it must feel like to be able to fly away from all of this, while wearing only a single layer of clothing. By now, the news of your night with the Daimyo will have traveled throughout the palace. Everyone now knows that you were the one who was summoned. Everyone is now recalculating their positions, including you, because that is what being a concubine really means. It means balancing your emotions with your calculations, your intimacy with your strategy, and your desires with an absolute and unwavering silence. You smooth your sleeve. You take a breath. Today, you may not be the favorite, but you are still in the game. And in this palace, survival looks an awful lot like stillness and silk. You do not need to have ears to be able to hear the gossip in a palace. You just need to have a functioning intuition and a decent understanding of passive-aggressive phrasing. Within an hour of sunrise, your name has already floated through at least 3 different courtyards, 2 tea rooms, and a suspiciously loud flower arranging session. No one ever says it directly, of course. They will say things like, "How radiant Lady So and so seems this morning," which is just their way of saying, "She is glowing because she was the one who was chosen last night, and we are all just pretending not to notice." Or they might say, "I wonder if his lordship prefers traditional poetry, or if he prefers livelier company these days." The translation of this is, "She probably just recited something dumb and she still got picked." It is unbelievable. You hear these things in passing snippets, whispered from behind fans or dropped into casual conversations like little poison seeds. It is impressive, in a way, like watching a group of trained assassins who are throwing shade at each other with floral metaphors. And what is your job in all of this? To stay quiet, to say nothing, to smile faintly, in the same way that a cat does when it knows something that you do not. Because engaging in the gossip is a risky move, but being the target of the gossip and then reacting to it, well, that is fatal. So instead, you just vanish a little. You take longer walks. You sit slightly further away from the group. You practice your calligraphy with such an intense focus that people begin to wonder if you are either deeply enlightened or if you are quietly scheming. Either way, that is a good thing because in the concubine arena, invisibility is a superpower. The loud ones are the ones who get noticed, and the ones who get noticed are the ones who get envied. And in this place, envy is basically just a decorative dagger in a silk sheath. You respond to the barbed compliments with a kindness that is so polite it is almost insulting. "Oh, you think my robe is too elaborate? Thank you so much. It was a gift." You smile, you bow, and you exit the scene. You survive on restraint, on timing, and on the occasional knowing glance that suggests that you could destroy someone if you only cared enough to do so. And while the others are all scrambling for proximity to power, you are busy perfecting the art of subtle distance. You do not need to always be in the spotlight because you have already been in it once. It starts out subtly. There are fewer glances in your direction, and the summonses come more slowly. One day, the maid forgets to bring you your favorite incense. The next, your tea arrives lukewarm. The message is clear. It is not harsh, it is not cruel, it is just indifferent. You are no longer tonight's mystery. Someone else now is. She is either new or she is not. Maybe she has just had a glow-up and has written a conveniently timed poem. Either way, she is suddenly the new focus of everyone's attention. The fan of attention has now turned, and it is no longer pointing at you. You have to handle this like a professional. There are to be no complaints, no dramatics, just a slightly longer pause before you bow to the Daimyo, and an almost imperceptible tightness in your smile when someone says, "Is it not just lovely how youthful Lady Hannah looks these days?" Of course it is. Youth is so charming, and so very temporary. Now comes the real test. Can you remain poised while you are being quietly replaced? Can you fold your hands and compliment your successor on her hairpin while you are mentally calculating how long she will last before she trips over her own ambition? This is the unspoken part of the job. It is not just about being chosen, but about being unchosen with grace. The fall from favor is not a scandal. It is just a shift in the tide. You are still in the palace, you are still dressed like a painting, and you are still performing, but the spotlight has now moved, and you have to learn how to survive in the shadows without looking as though you care. You still show up to the garden, you still compose your poems, and you still sit perfectly still during the afternoon tea while everyone else is trying to read into the way that your cup is trembling. But the truth is, you do care. Of course you do. It is not just for him, but for the position, for the validation, and for the tiny bit of power that came with being the center of a very controlled universe. And now you are just a supporting character in someone else's story. But you are still here, you are still powdered, you are still composed, and you are still waiting because in a palace like this, everything eventually shifts. Fortunes, fashions, and favorites. All it takes is one wrong word, a broken fan, or a poetic metaphor about the rain that sounds just a little too personal. So you wait, not with bitterness, but with patience, because if favor can fade, then it can also return, and you will be ready for it when it does. Eventually, the paint comes off. It is not just the white rice powder that you wear like a suit of armor, but also the performance, the posture, and the careful pauses that you place between each of your words. At some point, whether it is years later or just in a brief moment of solitude, you will catch a glimpse of yourself without the costume. And the strange thing is, you are still there. Beneath all the layers of fabric, of reputation, of jealousy, of poems, and of politeness, there lives a woman who remembers everything. The first time she was summoned, the first compliment she received, and the first time she realized that she was no longer the favorite. You have played every part. You have been the muse, the rival, the mystery, and the shadow. You have smiled your way through rejection, and you have composed haikus while you were quietly planning your own emotional survival. And what do you have to show for all of it? A spine that is stronger than your obi, a memory that is sharper than any court gossip, and an entire palace of women who either fear you, envy you, or quietly hope that they will age half as well as you have. Because here is the secret that no one ever talks about. Concubines do age. They fade. But they also endure. And in a world that is built around staying desirable, endurance is the most rebellious act of all. You no longer rush to the mirror when the messenger arrives. You no longer wonder if your hair is pinned at just the right angle for seduction. Some days you even skip the full makeup ritual and just go and sit by the koi pond, because sometimes watching the fish do nothing at all feels more honest than trying to look like a poem. You still dress in silk, yes, but now you wear it for yourself. And when the new girls arrive, all powdered and bright-eyed, and walking down the same hallway that you once conquered, you just smile, not in a kindly way, and not in a cruel way, but just in a knowing way, because you have played the game. You have danced on the very edge of power with your lips painted red and your voice lowered to a mere whisper. And you are still here. You are still graceful. And you are still dangerous in your silence. So what remains when all the paint has worn off? You do. And that is more than anyone had ever expected. In ancient Babylon, the line between the sacred and the sensual was not just blurred. It was completely obliterated. The heart of this mystery lay in the towering temples of Ishtar, the goddess of love, of fertility, and of war. Unlike the prudish morality that would come centuries later, the Babylonians saw sexuality as a divine bridge, a way to reach the gods, not to offend them. Within these temples, ritual sex was not just accepted, it was expected. And it was not done in shadowy corners, but in the full view of heaven. According to ancient sources, particularly the ever-curious classical historian Herodotus, every Babylonian woman, at least once in her life, was required to present herself at the temple of Ishtar. There, she would wait, adorned in perfume and in prayer, until a stranger approached her and tossed a silver coin into her lap, the price of the goddess. No woman was allowed to refuse. The act itself, sex with a man she did not know, was not seen as scandalous, but as sacred. It was a public sacrifice of her body for the good of the cosmos. The temple was not a brothel, not in the way that we would understand it today. It was more like a stage where religion and desire would play out rituals that were older than the kings themselves. And the women who served there, the Natatu, were not of a lowly status. Many of them were priestesses or the daughters of nobility, and they were cloaked in silks and in mystery. Their duties were spiritual, ecstatic, and yes, they were also sexual. The idea was a simple and an utterly radical one. By engaging in the act of sex under the watchful gaze of the gods, fertility would be invoked, divine favor would be won, and the cosmic order would be maintained. The land would bear crops, the rivers would flow, and the wombs of the women would swell. It was not seen as a sin, it was seen as a form of sacred ecology. But let us not romanticize it entirely. Even in antiquity, not everyone agreed with this so-called sacred sex. Later Mesopotamian rulers would try to distance themselves from the practice, perhaps out of a sense of moral reform or due to political pressure. But for a brief, golden window in the history of Babylon, the body was not a vessel of shame. It was an altar. And the whispering walls of Ishtar's temple still echo with those long-forgotten moans of worship. If Babylon turned sex into a sacred duty, then the ancient Greeks turned it into a form of theater, one that came with masks, with wine, and with secrets. At the center of all of this was Dionysus, the god of wine, of ecstasy, and of revelry. And nothing quite captured his spirit like the Dionysian mysteries. Private initiation rites where the participants sought to dissolve the boundaries between the human and the divine. These were not your typical temple visits. The mysteries were held deep within the groves or in hidden sanctuaries, far away from the public eye. Only the initiated were allowed to enter, and what happened inside was a closely guarded secret. Outsiders would speculate about wild orgies and drunken chaos, but the truth, as it always is far more complex. The participants, both men and women alike, would prepare for the rites through fasting, music, dancing, and long processions. They would wear masks, animal skins, and sometimes nothing at all. The whole point of this was to shed your social identity, your ego, and even your own name. For a few hours, you were not a merchant, a servant, or a noble. You were a part of something that was primal, something that was older than the city walls themselves. Sexual energy likely played a role in these rites, not as a form of entertainment, but as a symbol of rebirth and of unity. In a society where most of life was highly structured, these rites allowed for a controlled collapse of the established order. They promised a sense of catharsis, a temporary breakdown of the barriers between man and woman, between the rich and the poor, and between the mortal and the divine. But it was not just a wild night in the woods. The mysteries were said to offer a deep and profound transformation. Those who returned from them claimed to have touched the divine, to have glimpsed something that was beyond all reason. And indeed, many of the initiates would describe a feeling of renewal, as if the chaos had burned away all of their illusions. Of course, not everyone approved of these practices. Philosophers like Plato distrusted these ecstatic rituals, fearing that they would lure people away from logic and from discipline. But for many of the Greeks, the Dionysian mysteries were a necessary counterpart to their rigid public lives. They offered something that the temples and the world of politics could not, an emotional truth. And that is the key here. These rituals were not about scandal. They were about transcendence. By embracing the wildness that lay within them, the Greeks believed that they could access something that was truly sacred. In ancient Egypt, fertility was not just about the crops or about childbirth. It was the very lifeblood of the kingdom, and no river symbolized that better than the Nile. Each year, its floodwaters would rise, spreading a layer of rich silt and life all across the land. The Egyptians saw this as a divine act, a sacred union between the sky and the earth, and they would celebrate it with rituals that were anything but subtle. One of the most intriguing of these festivals was held in honor of the god Min, a deity of fertility, of agriculture, and of masculine vigor. His statues left very little to the imagination, as he was often shown with an exaggerated and permanent sign of his virility. Min was not just a symbol of life, he was a symbol of potency. At his annual festival, large crowds would gather to watch the pharaoh himself participate in a ceremonial harvest, where he would cut the first sheaf of grain as an offering to the god. But this was not just a farming event. Dancers would perform, either nude or scantily clad, to celebrate the beauty of the human body and its role in the process of creation. Ritual chants, rhythmic drumming, and the burning of incense would create an atmosphere that blurred the line between spiritual exaltation and sensory pleasure. Women played a key role in many of these ceremonies, especially during the Festival of Drunkenness, which was dedicated to the goddess Hathor, the patron of love, of music, and of joy. This wild, annual celebration would involve a great deal of wine, music, and ecstatic dancing, all of which was meant to honor the myth in which Hathor had saved the world by drinking herself into a stupor. The participants believed that by reenacting the goddess's drunken joy, they were helping to restore the cosmic balance and to bring order out of chaos. Were there any sexual undertones to these rituals? Almost certainly, but they were not seen as being taboo. The Egyptians did not view sexuality through the lens of guilt or of shame. For them, it was just a part of nature's cycle, as vital and as sacred as the flooding of the Nile itself. In fact, some of the healing temples even included rituals where fertility problems were addressed not just with herbs, but also through symbolic acts that involved touch, suggestion, or sacred roleplay. These rituals would be overseen by the temple staff, who would act as intermediaries between the human and the divine. In ancient Egypt, to embrace pleasure was not to indulge oneself. It was to align oneself with the gods. And every kiss of the Nile would remind them that life, at its very core, was a sensual gift from the divine. Rome, a place where even chaos had a certain structure. And nowhere was that more evident than in the Festival of Lupercalia, the annual fertility festival that was held each February beneath the Palatine Hill. What had begun as a wild, rural rite in honor of the shepherd gods had morphed into one of the strangest public celebrations in all of Roman history. It was one part purification, one part party, and more than a little bit of provocative theater. The ritual was held in honor of Lupercus, a god who was associated with fertility and the protection of livestock. But the origin myth of the festival went even deeper than that. The cave of Lupercal was said to be the very spot where Romulus and Remus, the twin founders of Rome, had been suckled by a she-wolf, and that primal symbolism bled its way into the celebration itself. At the heart of the festivities were the Luperci, a group of young men who had been chosen to represent a wild and untamed energy. Clad in little more than goat skins, or sometimes nothing at all, they would run through the streets, playfully striking the women with strips of hide that were called februa. Far from being offended, the women would actively seek out these lashes. It was believed that being struck would enhance their fertility, would ease the pain of childbirth, and would even increase their sensual vitality. It was a messy and loud affair, and it was unapologetically earthy. There were sacrifices, there was feasting, and there were bawdy songs. But there was also a sense of a sacred intention behind it all. The Lupercalia festival marked the cleansing of the city, a symbolic brushing away of the stagnation of winter to make room for the renewal of spring. The sexual overtones were certainly present, but they were wrapped up in layers of myth, of nature, and of destiny. Later Roman poets, including Ovid, would go on to write about the Lupercalia with a mixture of humor and nostalgia. And while the more conservative voices of the time tried to tame the festivities over the years, the tradition held strong for centuries, until Christianity eventually swept in with its stricter moral lens. Interestingly, some historians have suggested that Valentine's Day may have grown out of the ashes of Lupercalia, transformed from a rite of goat skins into a celebration of paper hearts. But the root idea of the festival remained: fertility, love, and the strange human urge to ritualize desire. The Romans did not separate the physical from the sacred. They wrapped them around each other, like vines on a temple column, sometimes tangled, but always connected. And for one wild day each year, the people of Rome would let their inner wolves run free. If the Lupercalia was a public spectacle, then the Eleusinian mysteries were its spiritual opposite: secretive, sacred, and solemn. Celebrated annually for over 1,000 years in ancient Greece, these rites revolved around the myth of Demeter and Persephone, and they offered their initiates a powerful glimpse into the cycles of life, of death, and of rebirth. But beneath the poetic myth and the theatrical silence, some scholars believe that the ceremonies may have included symbolic, and perhaps even sensual, elements that were cloaked in allegory. Held in the sanctuary of Eleusis, which was just to the northwest of Athens, the mysteries would draw in thousands of participants, from philosophers to farmers. Unlike most other Greek religious practices, these rituals were not exclusive to any particular social status or gender. The only requirement was that of secrecy. To reveal what happened inside the sanctuary was a punishable offense, sometimes even by death. The rites were centered on the story of Persephone, the maiden who was abducted by Hades and was taken to the underworld. Her mother, Demeter, the goddess of agriculture, mourned for her so deeply that the earth itself began to wither. Their eventual reunion symbolized the return of life in the spring and the hope of life after death. So, what does all of this have to do with sex? Potentially everything. The myth itself is deeply symbolic. It is a story of abduction, of descent, of reunion, and of fertility. Some scholars have argued that the secret climax of the Eleusinian mysteries involved a dramatic reenactment of the myth, which may have possibly included a ritualized union between actors who were playing the parts of Persephone and a divine male consort. Whether this was a literal or a purely symbolic act, the experience was said to be an overwhelming one, emotionally, psychologically, and perhaps even physically. The participants would fast, they would walk in torchlit processions, they would drink a mysterious potion called Kykeon, and they would then enter the telesterion, the inner chamber where the final rites were held. Whatever it was that they saw in that space, it left them forever changed. Many of them would later describe it as a moment of enlightenment, an intimate encounter with the divine truth. But no one ever wrote down exactly what had happened. That is how deeply the vow of silence was respected. The Eleusinian mysteries were not about pleasure for its own sake. They were about transformation, the possibility that sensuality and divinity might meet, not in opposition, but in a sacred union. In a world where death was a constant presence, Eleusis offered the hope that perhaps through the darkness, there could come light, that through descent, there could be a return, and that through a sacred union, there could be an eternal renewal. While the Western rites would often wrap up sensuality in either myth or in secrecy, ancient India took a more direct and a more spiritual approach. This brings us to Tantra, a complex and often misunderstood tradition that regarded sexual energy not as a sin, but as a sacred force, a divine spark that, if it were harnessed properly, could lead to enlightenment. Tantra is not a single religion or a single doctrine. It emerged across various different schools of Hinduism and of Buddhism, and it evolved over the course of many centuries. At its very core, however, is the belief that the physical and the spiritual worlds are not separate from one another. To reach the divine, one does not have to escape from the body. One must fully inhabit it. Some of the tantric sects developed intricate rituals that were designed to transform everyday acts, such as eating, breathing, and even intimacy, into paths that could lead toward liberation. Among the most famous and the most controversial of these were the tantric sex rites, which involved carefully structured encounters between partners. These were not about indulgence. They were sacred ceremonies that were performed with meditation, with breath control, and with the chanting of mantras. Every movement had a symbolic meaning, and every moment was intentional. The male would represent Shiva, the god of stillness and of consciousness, while the female would embody Shakti, the goddess of energy and of creation. Their union would mirror the merging of these opposites, the eternal dance between chaos and order, between spirit and matter. The goal was not pleasure, but transcendence, a glimpse of the divine through the lens of desire. But let us clear up a common myth. Not all of Tantra involved sexual rituals. In fact, most of the tantric practices were deeply ascetic in nature. Chanting, visualizations, yoga, and an intense focus were all central to the tradition. The sexual aspect, when it was present, was just one doorway among many, and it was often shrouded in so many layers of symbolism that its true meaning can be difficult to decode. That being said, some texts, like the Kama Sutra, which is often mistaken for just a mere manual of different sexual positions, were rooted in the very same worldview. Pleasure was not to be condemned. It was to be studied, to be refined, and to be placed within a larger spiritual system. In medieval temples, such as those at Khajuraho and at Konark, there are sculptures of intertwined lovers that adorn the stone walls, not just as decoration, but as a declaration that the path to the sacred runs right through the senses. To the ancient tantrics, desire was not a distraction. It was a form of fuel, and when it was lit with wisdom and with reverence, it could burn a path straight to the very heart of the universe. Before there was Babylon, before there were the golden dynasties of Egypt, there was Sumer, one of the world's very first civilizations. And in its bustling temple complexes, particularly in the city of Uruk, the roots of sacred sexuality were already beginning to grow. At the very heart of it all was the goddess Inanna, who was later known as Ishtar, and her enigmatic priestesses, women whose very bodies were seen as vessels for a divine power. These women were not ordinary prostitutes. They were known as hierodules or sacred servants. Their sexuality was ritualized, it was honored, and it was seen as being a part of the cosmic order. In Sumerian texts and hymns, Inanna is described as a passionate and a sensuous deity who celebrated love, fertility, and pleasure. Her temple ceremonies would all reflect this ethos, the merging of the spiritual and the physical into a single, holistic form of worship. One of the most fascinating of the rituals that is believed to have taken place was the sacred marriage rite. Each year, during the New Year festival, the king of the land would symbolically marry the goddess through a high priestess. The ceremony would involve music, offerings, poetry, and according to many scholars, a physical union. This was not seen as just a mere spectacle. It was the centerpiece of the city's renewal. By reenacting the goddess's divine union with her lover, Daimyo, the king's rule was legitimized, the crops were blessed, and the cycle of life was renewed. Even outside of this major event, sacred sexuality was a part of the rhythm of temple life. The priestesses of Inanna were trained in music, in dance, in incantations, and in the arts of love. For those who were seeking spiritual purification or divine favor, a union with a hierodule was thought to bring them healing, insight, or fertility. It was a rite, not a transaction. The role was not without its complexities, however. Some of these women would hold powerful positions and would live within the protective walls of the temple, while others may have existed on its periphery, leaving them vulnerable to exploitation. Over time, the sacred aspect of these practices began to fade, and later empires would go on to paint them in a less favorable light, collapsing the divine into the profane. But in ancient Sumer, the body was not something to be repressed. It was a channel through which the divine would flow, like the water of a river flowing across the fertile earth. And in the sacred chambers of Inanna, love was more than just an emotion. It was a ritual. Far from the temples of the Near East and the mystic rituals of India, the ancient Celts would celebrate fertility with fire, with freedom, and with the forests. Their most sacred festival was called Beltane, and it was held on the eve of the month of May, a liminal time that lay between the spring and the summer, when the boundaries between the natural world and the supernatural world would become blurred. It was a celebration of life, of growth, and of desire, and it was anything but modest. The Celts believed that the world pulsed with a spiritual energy, with spirits in the trees, in the rivers, and in the stones. And during the festival of Beltane, the energy of reproduction and of rebirth would reach its absolute peak. Large bonfires would be lit on the tops of the hills, which symbolized purification and protection. The people would dance around the flames, they would leap through the smoke for blessings, and they would even lead their livestock between twin fires to guard them from any illnesses in the coming season. But it was what happened after the firelight had dimmed that gave Beltane its legendary reputation. Unmarried men and women would venture out into the woods together for what was known as a greenwood marriage. These were temporary unions which were free from any societal rules, and they were often consummated right there under the stars. It was not considered to be scandalous, but quite the opposite. These encounters were viewed as sacred acts, which were aligned with the fertility of the earth itself. To join with a partner on the night of Beltane was to participate in the cosmic rhythms of nature, and to mirror the union of the Earth Mother and the horned god, the divine masculine and the divine feminine. Some accounts have even suggested that married couples might have briefly suspended their vows for the night, not out of any sense of infidelity, but out of a reverence for tradition and for renewal. The children who were conceived during Beltane were sometimes called the children of the fire, as they were believed to be blessed with great strength and vitality. It was a festival where the rules were softened, where desire was acknowledged, and where life itself was celebrated in its rawest and most natural form. There were no temples. Nature was the altar, the forest was the bedchamber, and the flame was the witness. With the arrival of Christianity, many of these practices were either condemned or suppressed, but the echoes of Beltane still survive today in our modern May Day rituals, in our folk dances, and in the quiet whispers of the old ways. By the time that Christianity had spread all across Europe and the Near East, the sacred sexuality of the ancient world was facing a quiet extinction. What had once been a ritual, performed in temples, in forests, and at festivals, was now increasingly being rebranded as a sin. The body, which had once been seen as a vessel of a divine energy, was now being recast as a source of temptation. Pleasure became something that was to be resisted, not revered. But this shift did not happen overnight. In its earliest days, Christianity was not yet the institutional power that it would later become. It grew in the margins of society, among the mystics, the ascetics, and the radical thinkers. Some of these early sects, like the Gnostics, held beliefs that echoed those of the older spiritual systems. They saw the physical world, including our own sexuality, as a metaphor for a higher truth. Some of the Gnostic texts even framed the union of the male and the female as a mirror of the divine unity that exists between the spiritual opposites, a concept that is reminiscent of the tantric ideas from India or the symbolic marriages of ancient Sumer. One particularly mysterious sect, which was known as the Carpocratians, reportedly practiced spiritual rituals that included a physical union, as they believed that true enlightenment required one to experience all things, including desire, without any sense of shame or of fear. These fringe communities were quickly labeled as heretical by the emerging church, and their writings were either destroyed or were buried. But hints of their existence still remain in dusty old codices, in the Gospels that were excluded from the Bible, and in the quiet survival of old symbols that were repurposed for a new dogma. As the orthodoxy of the church began to tighten its grip, the rituals of sacred sexuality were driven underground. Temples were either razed or were converted into churches, and festivals like Beltane were either rebranded or were forbidden altogether. The sacred prostitute became a sinner, and the sensual mystic became a heretic. But the people, being people, still remembered. They remembered in secret, in their stories, and in their symbols. Medieval mystics like Hildegard of Bingen would write of a divine ecstasy that sounded suspiciously physical. Visionaries would describe their spiritual raptures using the language of union and of passion. Even the saints, in their moments of their closest communion with God, would often use metaphors that blurred the line between the body and the spirit. And so, the sacred did not just vanish. it transformed. What had begun in the groves of Eleusis, in the chambers of Inanna, and in the forests of the Celts had never truly died. It simply went underground, into our poetry, into our dreams, and into our memories. Because while the temples can be destroyed and the rituals can be forbidden, the human longing to merge the physical with the divine, well, that is eternal. In the shadowed corridors of ancient Athens, where reason was supposed to triumph over the desire for vengeance, poison was handed down in a simple cup. In the year 399 BCE, the philosopher Socrates, one of the most influential minds in all of Western thought, was sentenced to death not by the sword nor by exile but by a drink of hemlock. It was a strange trial right from the very start. Socrates, a man who owned no property, who had written no books, and who had claimed to know nothing, was accused of corrupting the youth and of introducing new gods to the city. In truth, he had simply become a thorn in the side of the Athenian elite by questioning their authority, by mocking the self-proclaimed wise men, and by teaching his students to do the same. His very method of teaching, which was to ask relentless questions, was seen not as a form of education, but as an act of sedition. The court offered him some alternatives. He could suggest a lighter punishment for himself, such as a fine or exile or anything else. But Socrates, who was as stubborn in his death as he had been in his life, refused to beg. Instead, he proposed something that was completely absurd, that he should be rewarded for his service to the city of Athens. The jury was not amused. The sentence was to be death by hemlock. Hemlock was not the dramatic blade of an assassin. It was a clinical and an efficient poison, a slow paralysis that would begin in the limbs and would then creep its way upwards until it finally reached the heart. There would be no blood. There would be no screams. There would just be silence. On his final day, surrounded by his friends and his students, Socrates was cheerful. He bathed himself, he said goodbye to his children, and he took the poison with a calm sense of resignation. As the cold numbness began to reach his legs, he continued to speak about the immortality of the soul, discussing his own death not as an end, but as a transition. His followers all wept, but Socrates did not. He died with his mind still intact, a final lesson in control, in conviction, and in principle. He could have easily escaped. His supporters had already arranged it for him, but he chose to obey the law, even an unjust one, as he believed that undermining the city's order would do more harm than his own death would. And so, Athens had rid itself of its greatest critic, not with chains or with torture, but with a cup of tea that had been brewed from a lethal root. In killing Socrates, they had not silenced him. They had made him immortal. Hemlock did not stop his voice. It just amplified it through the passage of time. When you think of Cleopatra, you likely picture the seductress queen who was draped in silk and who would whisper in Latin to Julius Caesar and in Greek to Mark Antony. But beyond all the politics and the poetry, Cleopatra was also a student of science, and particularly of toxicology. She was not just beautiful. She was dangerous in ways that very few people ever suspected. As the ruler of Egypt, Cleopatra had access to one of the greatest libraries in all of the ancient world. And within those scrolls were the secrets not just of the stars and of the gods, but also of poisons, of venoms, and of their effects on the human body and mind. She reportedly maintained her own personal laboratory, and she even conducted experiments on prisoners, where she would test various different concoctions to observe which of the toxins would kill quickly, which would cause the most agony, and which would leave no trace behind. She was not cruel for the sake of being cruel. In her world, poison was a form of politics, and it was a form of preparation. Cleopatra did not trust blades or battles to do the job when a single drop of venom could be faster, quieter, and much more precise. Assassination by poison was the scalpel in the toolkit of the rulers of the time, and Cleopatra was a surgeon. She studied nightshade, strychnine, hemlock, and aconite. She experimented with mixtures of snake venom and of various herbs. Some of her poisons would cause hallucinations, while others would mimic an illness. Some would kill within a matter of moments, while others would take hours, allowing time for confessions to be extracted or for the blame to be redirected onto someone else. And then, of course, there is the asp, the snake that she supposedly used to end her own life. The legend says that when Octavian, who would later become Augustus Caesar, had conquered Egypt, Cleopatra had refused to be paraded through the streets of Rome as a captive. Instead, she had clasped an ASP to her breast, and its venom had claimed her life. But even the manner of her death is still debated. Some historians believe that she may have swallowed a fast-acting poison that she had hidden in a hairpin or in some ointment. After all, Cleopatra would have known exactly which poisons would cause convulsions and which would bring about a graceful death. The ASP may have simply been the perfect symbol for her, a quiet sting for a queen who was too proud to ever be caged. To Cleopatra, poison was not a crime. It was a form of control. It was the art of deciding who would live, who would die, and how history would remember her. And if her enemies ever underestimated her because of her charm, they often never lived long enough to regret it. In the Roman Empire, power did not just corrupt, it also poisoned, quite literally. Behind the golden columns of the imperial palace, poison became the preferred method for eliminating one's rivals. There were no messy civil wars, no public executions, just a cup of wine, a bowl of figs, and then a corpse before dessert. The emperors were no strangers to betrayal, and very few of them ever trusted their own inner circles. In the 1st century CE, under the rule of the Emperor Claudius, poison had entered its golden age, thanks to one particular woman, Locusta, Rome's most infamous professional poisoner. Locusta was not just some shadowy figure who was lurking in a back alley with a vial. She was a trained expert, practically a chemist by the standards of the ancient world, who would serve the political ambitions of the powerful. When Agrippina the Younger, who was Claudius's wife, wanted her own son, Nero, to be on the throne, she called upon Locusta. The result was a carefully poisoned dish of mushrooms, which were Claudius's favorite, and a rapid decline in the emperor's health. But the drama did not stop there. Once Nero had become the emperor, he employed Locusta as his own personal royal assassin. When his teenage stepbrother, Britannicus, had posed a threat to his throne, Locusta was once again summoned. The young prince died in the middle of a banquet, convulsing in front of the horrified guests. Nero was so impressed by her work that he gave Locusta a full pardon, a plot of land, and even some students to be trained in her deadly craft. In Rome, poison was the weapon of the educated and the aristocratic. It was subtle and it was difficult to trace. While blades would leave behind witnesses, poison would leave behind only doubt. Was it an illness? Was it indigestion? Was it a form of divine punishment? The paranoia that this bred was enormous. Cups were tested, food was tasted, and even the slaves became suspects. The Romans developed elaborate defenses against poison. They used silver spoons to detect certain toxins, they had antidotes that were made from crushed emeralds, and they had the famous theriac, a universal antidote that was made from dozens of different ingredients, including opium and the flesh of vipers. Yet, none of it could ever stop the slow tide of quiet deaths. Poison in Rome was more than just a tool. It was a language, a silent negotiation that took place between survival and ambition. And in the halls of marble and of blood, it whispered even louder than the swords. In ancient China, poison was less a crime and more of an art form. Among the imperial courts of the Han, the Tang, and the Ming dynasties, it became a subtle language of power, one that was used in whispers, in silk sleeves, and in teacups. There were no grand gestures, just a soft breath, and then a deafening silence. The Chinese elite were masters of pharmacology. Traditional Chinese medicine would often blur the lines between healing and harm. Just a pinch too much of a certain herb, and the cure could become the killer. The court alchemists and the palace physicians would walk a tightrope, creating antidotes one day and then poisons the next. But the true experts in this quiet war were often the women, particularly the imperial consorts and the concubines. Forbidden from ever wielding swords or from holding any political titles, some of them would turn to more discreet methods of getting what they wanted. A rival could be removed not through a scandal, but through a sudden sickness. The Empress Dowager might never have to raise her voice, but only her eyebrow, and then, just days later, a challenger would be found coughing up blood in their bed. One infamous example of this is the Empress Lu Ji of the Han Dynasty. After she had secured her own power, she had systematically eliminated all of the threats to her rule, including her rivals within the harem. Her methods were grim, and they included both poisoning and a slow form of mutilation. She was not just feared, she was legendary, a ruler who had used medicine not to heal the empire, but to bend it to her own will. Even beyond the walls of the palace, poison was a feared political weapon. The assassins of secret societies, like the Five Poison Sect, were rumored to have coated their blades with toxic herbs, or to have slipped lethal tinctures into the ceremonial wine. Poison was not just effective, it was also theatrical, and it was a statement. It said, "I can reach you, even here." Because of this, the Chinese developed one of the most advanced systems of poison detection in the entire ancient world. Officials would test their meals with silver chopsticks, as they believed that they would tarnish in the presence of arsenic. The imperial kitchens became like mini laboratories, not just for the creation of flavor, but also for the assurance of safety. In China, poison was not an impulsive act. It was precise, it was ritualistic, and it was like a move in a game of chess, not a brawl. And though it was rarely ever seen, it ruled over the dynasties just as surely as the emperors themselves did. In the ancient courts of India, there existed a tale that was so chilling it sounds as though it must be a work of mythology, yet it appears in the royal texts, in the legends, and in the political treatises of the time. These were the Vishakanyas, or the poison maidens, women whose very bodies were said to be lethal, not because they carried daggers, but because they themselves were the daggers. The legend says that certain young girls, who had been chosen at a very early age, were slowly fed minute doses of poison day after day, drop by drop. Their bodies would then build up an immunity to the poison, but in turn, their blood, their sweat, and even their very breath would become toxic to others, especially to their lovers. A kiss from a Vishakanya, it was said, could mean certain death. Intimacy was not an act of passion. It was an execution. This practice is alleged to have begun under the rule of Chanakya, the cunning strategist and the royal advisor to Chandragupta Maurya. Around the 4th century BCE, Chanakya was a firm believer in the use of espionage and of psychological warfare. According to the Arthashastra, an ancient political manual that is attributed to him, poison was not just a tool of war, it was a tool of statecraft. Enemies could be seduced and then slain, without ever having to raise a single sword. So, were the Vishakanyas real? Well, that is still a matter of debate. Some scholars think that they were just metaphorical symbols of a seductive danger, or that they were just cautionary tales against the temptations of the court. Others have argued that there may have been some real attempts to create such assassins through the practice of gradual poisoning, a practice that is known in both Ayurveda and in ancient medicine as Vishakrama. Even if they were just a legend, the fear that they invoked was very real. Foreign dignitaries would be warned, meals would be tested, and any beautiful stranger who arrived at the court might be seen not as a gift, but as a threat that was dressed in silk. In India, poison was not always hidden away in a goblet. Sometimes it wore jewelry, it smiled sweetly, and it danced in the royal courts. And this idea that beauty could kill would go on to feed centuries of intrigue, of suspicion, and of countermeasures. What made the myth of the Vishakanya so terrifying was not just the poison itself, but the intimacy of the danger that it presented. Death did not ride into battle on a horse. It would just lean in close and whisper in your ear. If there was ever a king who saw threats in every single shadow, it was Herod the Great, the ruler of Judea under the authority of the Romans in the 1st century BCE. He was a man of grand architecture, of brutal politics, and of deep, deep insecurities. Herod did not trust in swords alone to keep him on the throne. In his court, poison was just paranoia that had been made into a liquid. Herod's reign was infamous for its violence, but not all of his executions were public spectacles. Some of them were private, very private. As his power grew, so did his fear of his rivals, of any Roman suspicion, and most tragically of all, of his own family. His wife, Mariam, who was a Hasmonean princess of noble blood, was once the love of his life. But Herod had become convinced, wrongly, that she was plotting against him. She was executed, and so were her mother, her grandfather, and eventually his own sons. According to Josephus, the ancient Jewish historian, Herod had had Mariam's sons poisoned in secret, under the guise of Roman justice. They had been popular, and they were legitimate heirs to the throne with royal Jewish blood, and that is what had made them so dangerous. Herod could not allow any future coup to have a noble figurehead. And the poisonings did not stop there. Herod had used informants, interrogators, and yes, poisons to quietly eliminate anyone who even appeared to be disloyal to him. His ministers, his servants, and his relatives. Some of them were drugged to induce confessions, while others were simply removed with no explanation, with their illnesses being blamed on either divine wrath or on just the bad air. Poison had allowed Herod to rule with a surgical kind of cruelty. It did not stir up any public unrest in the same way that crucifixions or beheadings would have. It was clean, it was discreet, and it sent a very clear message. No one was untouchable, not even those who shared his own bloodline. Herod's obsession with poison had even extended beyond just the act of assassination. In his final days, as he was racked with disease and with madness, he had feared that his own death would go unmourned. He had ordered that all of the prominent Jewish leaders were to be gathered together and then executed upon his own death, just to ensure that there would be a sense of national grief. Thankfully, that order was never carried out, but the paranoia that had filled his court had long since poisoned his own legacy. In the grand halls of Persepolis, amidst the golden columns and the carved reliefs of warriors and of lions, another battle was unfolding. One that was not of armies, but of whispers and of goblets. In the Achaemenid Empire, where the kings would rule over entire continents, poison had become a tool of refinement. It was elegant, it was deadly, and it was often completely invisible. The Persian court, under the rule of kings like Darius the Great and Xerxes, was a place of great opulence and of ceremony. But it was also a hive of political maneuvering, of palace rivalries, and of dynastic ambition. With dozens of wives, of concubines, of sons, of satraps, and of generals all vying for influence, poison had become the quiet equalizer. Historical records from Greek sources, and especially from the ever-dramatic Herodotus, tell of assassination plots that were cloaked in luxury. Food tasters were a standard practice, and the kitchens were locked down like they were military zones. The mere suspicion of a poisoning was enough to see a cook or a cupbearer executed on the spot. One infamous figure from this time was Bagoas, a Persian eunuch and a court official who had risen to a position of immense power under the rule of Artaxerxes III in the 4th century BCE. According to the historical accounts, Bagoas had poisoned not just his enemies, but also the king himself. And then he had installed a puppet monarch, only to then poison him too when he proved to be too difficult to control. Bagoas had controlled the court not through the use of armies, but through the use of apothecary jars. The Persian knowledge of herbal medicine was very advanced, and so was their understanding of the various different toxins. From aconite to arsenic, they had experimented with a wide range of subtle agents. Slow-acting substances that would mimic a natural illness, or fast-acting ones that would strike like a bolt of lightning. Poison was not just a method of execution, it was an art form of discretion. Because in Persia, power was built upon appearances. To kill someone publicly was to risk a scandal, but to use poison, well, that would just let the empire breathe a little more easily, while its enemies all died quietly in their beds. A noble would go to sleep one night feeling victorious, and then he would never wake up again. Even the death of Alexander the Great, which had occurred shortly after he had conquered Persia, was rumored to have been from a poison that had been derived from the Eastern knowledge of the time, and that had been slipped into his wine during a banquet in Babylon. Whether this is true or not, the very suspicion of it reveals the reputation that the Persians held for their use of this form of invisible warfare. In the Achaemenid Empire, the kings would reign through their image, their wealth, and their sense of order. Though it was less theatrical than in the palaces of Rome or in the harems of Persia, the ancient culture of Israel and its surrounding regions did not exist outside the reach of poison. In fact, the Bible contains several curious references to deadly herbs, to tainted drinks, and to divine tests that involved the use of toxic brews. This suggests that poison was known, it was feared, and it was sometimes even used as a way to prove a person's guilt or their innocence. One of the strangest examples of this comes from the Book of Numbers, where a ritual that was called the ordeal of the bitter water is described. If a man had suspected that his wife had committed adultery, he could take her to a priest, who would then mix some holy water with the dust from the temple floor and would then force her to drink it. The idea was a simple one. If she was guilty, Then the cursed drink would cause her belly to swell and would curse her womb. But if she was innocent, then nothing would happen. This was not just a form of divine intervention. It was an early form of a trial by poison, a dangerous liquid that was used not to kill someone outright, but to provoke a reaction and to extract the truth. Elsewhere in the scriptures, poison appears more metaphorically, but still with a dark and a heavy weight. In the book of Deuteronomy, the land of Israel is warned against the worship of any false gods, with the threat that the people's food and their water would be cursed with gall and with wormwood, both of which were known in antiquity for their bitterness and for their toxicity. In the book of Job, poison is compared to an act of injustice, and in the Psalms, the wicked are said to have poison under their tongues, a symbol of their deception and of their deadly intent. And then there is also Herod, who appears in the New Testament and whose reputation for the use of poison we have already covered earlier, which links the biblical history of the time with the greater story of the use of toxic politics throughout the ancient world. While we do not see any dramatic assassinations by poison in the core biblical texts, the awareness of its power was certainly there. The Hebrews lived among empires where the use of poison was a courtly art, and they had adapted their own legal and their own spiritual interpretations to fit in with that dangerous reality. Across all of the empires of antiquity, from the halls of Athens to the sands of Egypt, and from the palaces of Rome to the forests of India, one particular weapon remained universal: the elegant and the terrifying use of poison. It required no army, and it left behind no battlefield. It would kill without any noise, without any witnesses, and often without anyone to blame. In an age where brute force would rule the public square, poison was the preferred tool of the private war, the conflicts that were fought behind the curtains, in the bedrooms, in the banquet halls, and in the temples. It was a political equalizer, a whisper of death in a place where a shout might have brought about chaos. But poison was more than just a method. It was also a message. In ancient times, to die by the sword was considered to be an honorable death. It meant that you were a threat that was worth confronting openly. To die by poison, however, was something else entirely. It meant that someone who was close to you, someone who you had trusted, had made a choice. Poison always involved a sense of betrayal. It could be a servant, a spouse, a cupbearer, or a family member. It turned every single bite of food into a gamble, and every single goblet of wine into a test of loyalty. The ancient world had a great deal of respect for the subtlety of poison. Philosophers saw it as a symbol of fate, of punishment, or of a power that was disguised as grace. The religions of the time would invoke it as a form of divine judgment, and the rulers would use it to maintain the illusion of peace while they were quietly rewriting their own bloodlines. What makes the use of poison so enduring is its inherent paradox. It is at once both cowardly and clever, both invisible and unforgettable. It does not just kill the body. It also erodes any sense of trust. It leaves behind a great deal of suspicion, and it casts long shadows over the legacies of those who have been its victims. Even today, its mythology still lingers on. The hemlock of Socrates, the asp of Cleopatra, the poisoned figs of Claudius, and the Vishakanyas of India. These are more than just deaths. They are parables, reminders that in the theater of power, the deadliest of all the actors are often the ones who never even take to the stage. Poison has no face, it has no voice, and it has no armor, but in the annals of ancient history, it has shaped dynasties, it has rewritten successions, and it has whispered its way through every single corridor of power. It was, and it still is, the perfect assassin. It all began with wood, with dust, and with a great deal of ingenuity. Along the banks of the Nile, in ancient Egypt, the land of the pyramids, of the priests, and of great precision, the act of protecting one's possessions was more than just a practical matter. It was also a symbolic one. Whether it was the grain that was being stored away for a time of famine, the papyrus scrolls that were hidden away in the temple chambers, or the treasures that were being entombed with a pharaoh, access to these things had to be controlled. And for that, they invented something that was truly revolutionary: the pin tumbler lock. Dating back as early as the year 2000 BCE, these were the world's very first known mechanical locks, and they were carved entirely out of wood. The device was quite rudimentary by our modern standards, but it was conceptually brilliant. The lock consisted of a horizontal bolt that would slide into a frame to secure a door. The bolt had a series of holes that were drilled into it, and when it was pushed into place, a set of vertical pins would drop down into those holes from above, locking the door firmly shut. To unlock it, you would need a key, but not just any key. This early Egyptian key was a large, wooden instrument that often resembled a toothbrush with a set of pegs on it. When it was inserted into the top of the lock, the key would lift the pins up and out of the bolt holes, which would then allow the bolt to be slid open. There was no brute force, no use of a chisel, just a clever design and the force of gravity. This was more than just a simple gadget. It was a whole philosophy of protection. For the Egyptians, who believed in the concept of order or ma'at over the concept of chaos, it fed into the idea of regulating access, of closing off a chamber, and of choosing who was allowed to enter and who was not. It was a concept that carried a very deep meaning. Locks were used in their homes, in their temples, and in their tombs. The pharaohs were buried in sealed chambers, which would sometimes have locked doors and even false passages. Security was not just about protecting their possessions. It was about ensuring their eternity. What is so astonishing about this is just how familiar this technology still feels to us today. The basic pin and key concept that was behind the wooden Egyptian lock still exists in our modern metal locks today. There are still pins that drop into holes, and there are still keys that lift them up into alignment. It is a 4,000-year-old idea that has remained unchanged in its basic principle. Though the wooden mechanisms of these locks have eventually all decayed, and very few of the original keys have ever survived, the design was so effective that it went on to spread throughout the world. It whispered its way from Egypt to the Greeks, then on to the Romans, and then eventually to the rest of the entire world. Before the tumblers ever clicked and the bolts ever slid into place, there were the seals, the silent sentinels of ancient Mesopotamia. In the cities of Babylon and of Nineveh, locks as we know them today were not yet a common thing. But the people of Mesopotamia had already developed a remarkably effective way to secure, to authenticate, and to restrict access to their possessions. Their solution was not a mechanical one. It was a symbolic one. This brings us to the cylinder seal. These small, intricately carved cylinders were worn around the neck or around the wrist, much like a ring or a pendant. Each of these seals was unique, a personal signature that was often etched with mythological scenes, with animals, with gods, or even with cuneiform inscriptions. To use it, a person would roll the cylinder across a soft surface of wet clay, which would then leave behind a long impression, a kind of an ancient barcode, if you will. Seals were used to close up jars, to secure doorways, and to protect caskets. If someone had tried to break in, the clay seal would have cracked, which would have made any form of tampering immediately obvious. More than that, the impression itself would have verified who it was that had closed the container or the room in the first place. You did not need a key to be able to open it. You just needed a very good reason to be breaking the seal. It was a primitive system, yes, but it was also an incredibly effective one in a society where one's reputation and their official marks carried an enormous amount of weight. In the temples, the priests would seal up the sacred storerooms with their own personal sigils. The merchants would seal their contracts. Even the kings would use seals to lock away their correspondence. Entire economies would operate under the authority of this one little carved token. Security in Mesopotamia was not about the denial of access through the use of force, but it was about the proof of one's legitimacy. If the seal was still intact, then the contents were safe. But if it was broken, then something was wrong. The seal system also introduced another radical new concept: the idea of one's identity as a form of security. The seal was not just a tool. It was a mark of trust, of authority, and often of a legal power. If you had lost your seal, you had not just misplaced a tool. You had lost your very name. It is no exaggeration to say that these cylinder seals were the earliest form of a two-factor authentication system. It was not a password, it was not a PIN, but it was a physical artifact that said, "This is mine, and only I have the right to be able to open it." While the Mesopotamians had relied on their seals and the Egyptians had mastered the use of wooden pin locks, the ancient Greeks had brought a new kind of craftsmanship to the world of personal security. With their growing cities, their private homes, their temples, and their treasuries, the Greeks had begun to develop more compact, more durable, and more practical locking mechanisms. And with them had come the rise of the locksmith, a new and specialized trade in the ancient world. The Greek locks were a step forward from the bulky wooden designs of the Egyptians. They would often use metal components, though many of the parts were still fashioned out of wood, due to the constraints of the available resources and the costs. The most common form of lock was the bolt lock, where a sliding bar would fit into a catch or a groove in the door frame. It would then be secured in place with a metal pin or a peg, and it could only be released by using a specially shaped key, which was often made of either bronze or iron. But the Greek keys were not the small, pocket-sized versions that we know of today. These were long, L-shaped rods, which were sometimes almost as long as a human forearm. To unlock a door, the key would be inserted into a vertical keyhole and would then be used to lift and to manipulate the internal pins or the pegs, which would then allow the bolt to be able to slide free. The motion was both a physical and a symbolic one. To carry a key was to carry a sense of authority, and to use it was to assert one's control over a certain space. The temples would use locks to secure their votive offerings, and the wealthy citizens would lock up their chests that were filled with coinage or with jewelry. Even the public buildings would have their own secured archives and storerooms. The technology was not yet widespread, however. Most of the common homes would still rely on the use of wooden latches or on simple bars. But in the world of the aristocrats, of the scholars, and of the priests, the lock had become an object of both function and of status. What had set the Greeks apart was not just the mechanics of their locks, but also the philosophy that lay behind them. Security in Athens, especially, was tied to the concepts of property rights and of citizenship. A locked door meant that you had privacy, that you had ownership, and that you had a sense of autonomy. And the locksmith was no longer just a mere artisan. He was a technician of trust. In an era that was defined by public debate and by private drama, the Greek lock was the silent partner, the one who was keeping all of the secrets safe behind the oak doors and the stone vaults. If the Greeks had laid the groundwork for the future of locks, then the Romans had refined it. By the height of the Roman Empire, locks were no longer an experimental technology. They were everywhere. They were in the homes, in the temples, in the shops, and even on the wrists of the slaves. The Romans had brought a sense of structure to everything that they had touched, to their roads, to their laws, to their armies, and the world of security was no exception to this. The Roman locks became smaller, stronger, and much smarter. They used metal components, primarily bronze and iron, which meant that these locks would last for much longer and would be much harder to tamper with. The most common type of lock was the warded lock, a system where only a key with the correct set of notches on it could be able to rotate within the lock to be able to move the bolt. The wards were a set of fixed internal obstacles, and if your key did not have the right set of cuts on it, then it simply would not turn. This then led to the invention of the skeleton key, a stripped-down version of a key that could be used to bypass the wards in the simpler locks. The Romans had loved this little trick, and so did the thieves. But the real marvel of the Roman era was the puzzle lock. Small, intricately crafted mechanisms that were often built right into the boxes or the chests. These locks would require not just the right key, but sometimes also a certain sequence of movements or of pressure points to be able to unlock them. Some of them even used false keyholes to be able to throw off any would-be intruders. These were the ancient world's version of a combination safe. The Roman keys themselves were often small and elegant, and they were sometimes even worn as rings, a convenient blend of both utility and of jewelry. It was a common practice for Roman citizens to wear their keys on their fingers as a status symbol. If you had a key, it meant that you owned something that was worth locking up. Interestingly, some locks were also placed on the collars of the slaves, and they would be marked with inscriptions such as, "If found, please return to the master." These locks were not protecting any treasure. They were enforcing a sense of ownership, a chilling thought, but also a reminder that security in Rome was not always about protecting one's valuables. It was also about power. The Roman Empire's approach to locks was not just a practical one. It was also a personal one. The keys were made to fit your own specific lock and no one else's. They were used to protect not just your gold, but also your letters, your heirlooms, your recipes, and sometimes even your deepest secrets. While the West was busy refining its keys and its bolts, the East was quietly crafting its own elegant mechanical marvels. In ancient China, the art of lockmaking was not just a matter of utility. It was also a reflection of a sense of balance, of precision, and sometimes even of a spiritual harmony. By the time of the Zhou dynasty, which was around the year 100 BCE, Chinese artisans were already producing all-metal locks, which were often made from either bronze or, later on, from iron. These locks were compact, they were portable, and they were mechanically very sophisticated. Unlike the large and very visible systems that were being used in Egypt or in Greece, the Chinese locks were designed to be both discreet and efficient, and they were often built right into the chests, the cabinets, and even the gates of the time. The most iconic form of these locks was the Chinese padlock, or the suwa. These were usually either barrel-shaped or rectangular, and they would have a flat key that would be inserted into one end of them. Inside the lock, there would be a series of spring-loaded tumblers or pins that would all align when the right key was inserted, which would then allow the bolt to be able to slide free. Does that sound familiar? Well, it should. The pin tumbler design of these locks mirrored the very same logic that the Egyptians had pioneered centuries earlier, but the Chinese had taken it a step further by miniaturizing it and by improving its overall durability. Some of the locks were even shaped like animals or like mythical creatures, such as dragons, tigers, or turtles, which combined their practical use with a sense of a symbolic protection. A tiger-shaped lock on your chest was not just a form of security. It was also a form of a spiritual defense. The design of these locks would convey a sense of power, of guardianship, and often of good luck. China had also developed its own form of trick locks, early versions of puzzle locks that would require multiple different steps or deceptive angles to be able to open them. These were not just used to guard a person's money or their jewelry. The scholars and the officials of the time would also store their important documents, their calligraphy, or their family heirlooms in locked boxes that could only be opened by someone who truly understood the mechanism of the lock itself. Security was all about one's intellect, not just about their sense of ownership. Locksmithing had become a very respected trade. Some of the artisans of the time would keep their techniques a closely guarded secret, passing them down through their families. Others would go on to innovate new forms of locks that would then travel all along the Silk Road, influencing the security systems of the time as far away as the Middle East. In the very heart of ancient India, amidst all of the temples, the scrolls, and the intricate corridors of the palaces, the concept of security was treated not merely as a form of protection, but as an art form, as a ritual, and sometimes even as a spiritual safeguard. Though the ancient locks of India have not survived in as large of numbers as their Roman or their Chinese counterparts have, the references to them in the Sanskrit texts and the archaeological finds that have been made all suggest that by the time of the Maurya Empire, which was around the year 300 BCE, mechanical locks were not only in use, but they were also evolving in some very clever and culturally distinct ways. The Indian locks were often used to secure the temples, the treasure rooms, and the storage chests, many of which would contain not just a great deal of wealth, but also sacred relics or important royal documentation. These locks were primarily made of metal, they were small in their size, and they employed the use of either internal levers or of pin systems, with some of them even using sliding tumblers that were similar to the Chinese and the Roman designs of the time. But the ingenuity of the ancient Indians had taken a special turn toward the concept of camouflage security. The carved wooden panels in the temples and in the royal palaces would sometimes be used to conceal hidden compartments or false drawers, which would then be protected by secret trigger locks that only a select few would know how to operate. A push in just the right spot or a twist of a carved leaf, and a panel would spring open or would be shut tight. Some of these mechanisms are still able to baffle our modern-day restorers, as they were built with such a high degree of precision and of mystery that they almost border on being architectural riddles. The Sanskrit texts, like the Arthashastra, which was a political and an economic treatise from the Maurya era, detail the great importance of guarding one's information, one's treasure, and one's royal property by using secret rooms, double doors, and disguised locks. These were not just meant to be mechanical devices, they were also meant to be psychological ones. The idea was not only to keep any intruders out, but also to prevent them from even realizing that there was something there that needed to be protected in the first place. The locks in India were also deeply symbolic. A temple gate might be locked not just for the sake of security, but also as a part of a ritual cycle, and it would only be opened on the most auspicious of days. Certain lock designs would even incorporate the images of lotus flowers, of serpents, or of sacred geometry, which would act as both a deterrent and as a blessing. In the philosophy of India, protection was not always about confrontation. It was about redirection, about illusion, and about a sense of wisdom. In the misty forests and the icy fjords of ancient northern Europe, locks were not simply just tools of convenience. They were also statements of one's territory. They were symbols of their ownership, and at times, they were even used as charms against the unknown. Among the Celts, whose societies had flourished all across the Iron Age of Britain and of Gaul, the concept of security was more of a practical matter than it was an ornamental one. Their homes and their granaries would often rely on the use of heavy wooden bars, of iron door rings, and of sliding bolts. Yet, the archaeological digs that have been conducted at the Celtic sites have managed to unearth both padlocks and keys, which were often simple in their design, but which were made with a surprising degree of precision. This is some of the earliest evidence that we have of the use of iron-forged warded locks, which were much like those that were being used in the Roman world at the time. It is likely that these technologies had spread through the contact that the Celts had had with the Roman traders or with the occupying Roman forces. But for the Celts, protection was not always just a mechanical matter. It was also a spiritual one. Their homes would be guarded with charms, with symbols, and with ritual markings that would be placed on their thresholds, not just to ward off any thieves, but also any evil spirits. A locked door may have been able to keep out the raiders, but a carved triskele or a hanging amulet was meant to keep out any mischievous fairies or any vengeful ghosts. In their worldview, security was not just a physical concept. It was a cosmic one. The Norse, too, had taken their locks very seriously, especially when it came to the matters of storage and of seafaring. The Viking ships and their chests were often equipped with iron padlocks that had been designed to be able to withstand the weather, any acts of theft, and any acts of sabotage. Some of the Norse keys that have been shaped like serpents, like axes, or even like miniature versions of Thor's hammer. These were both functional tools, and they were also symbols of authority. To carry a key was to own, to command, and to protect. The women in the Viking society would often be the ones who would hold the keys to the household, quite literally. Archaeological finds have shown that women were often buried with elaborate key rings and with belt-hung lockpicks. In a way, the key was not just about gaining entry to a place. It was also a symbol of one's status, of their trust, and of their identity. Interestingly enough, Norse mythology itself even touches upon the concepts of locking and of unlocking. The gods would use runes to be able to seal their doors, and certain spells were designed to be able to either bind or to unbind a person's fate, which echoes the symbolic power of locks that existed beyond just the physical world. So, while the North may not have had the same ornate puzzle locks of the Romans or the same philosophical elegance of the Chinese, their locks were still able to tell their own unique story, one that had been forged in iron, in tradition, and in superstition. As the Western Roman Empire had begun to crumble, the Byzantine Empire had risen up in the East, carrying forward the legacy of Roman engineering and its love for the use of locks. But the Byzantine Empire did not just preserve the ancient designs of the Romans. It also refined them by combining the Roman mechanics with a new sense of Eastern elegance, while at the same time passing on their security technology on into the Islamic Golden Age. The Byzantine locks were often miniature masterpieces. Their padlocks, which were shaped like animals, like crosses, or like abstract patterns, were made from either bronze or from iron, and they used some very advanced ward systems that would require the use of some very precisely cut keys. Many of the Byzantine locks would incorporate the use of rotating bolts, of spring-loaded mechanisms, and even of false keyholes, which would all go on to lay the groundwork for our modern-day puzzle locks. The tradition of wearing one's keys as a badge of their status had also continued. Bishops and abbots would often carry around ceremonial keys to their churches and to their archives, which would emphasize the fact that access to these places was a sacred privilege. But it was in the Islamic caliphates, and especially during the Abbasid era, that the science of security had truly blossomed into both an art form and a source of innovation. Building upon the knowledge that they had gained from the Persians, from the Indians, from the Greeks, and from the Romans, the Islamic craftsmen had elevated the art of lockmaking into a very highly respected trade. The Abbasids, who were ruling from the city of Baghdad, had developed some extremely sophisticated lock systems, some of which would have as many as 4 or 5 internal levers, some very intricate tumblers, and even some early forms of combination mechanisms. Their padlocks were both beautiful and they were also very cunning. The brass locks that were shaped like lions, like fish, or like birds were not only functional, but they were also statements in and of themselves. There would often be Arabic inscriptions that would adorn the sides of these locks, which would either be praising Allah or would be stating the owner's name, thus fusing together the concepts of faith, of identity, and of security. The Islamic scholars of the time would also write treatises on the various different mechanical devices. Al-Jazari, the 12th century Muslim inventor, had famously documented dozens of different mechanisms, including water clocks and automatic locks, some of which had involved the use of some very complex gears and some hidden triggers. He is often regarded as being one of the earliest mechanical engineers in all of history, and many of his principles are still used to inform the art of lockmaking even to this day. Meanwhile, the Islamic markets and the palaces of the time would all rely on these evolving locks to be able to secure everything from their treasure chests and their religious relics to their library doors and their merchant stalls. In a time when the worlds of science and of theology would often walk hand in hand, a well-made lock was not just a form of protection. It was also a reflection of the divine order and of the human mastery over it. By the end of antiquity, the use of locks had evolved far beyond just the simple use of bolts and of bars. They had become symbols of civilization itself, tools that were able to reflect a society's values, its fears, and its ambitions. Whether they were forged in iron, they were carved in wood, or they were hidden away behind some sacred geometry, the ancient locks were not just about keeping things out. They were also about deciding who it was that was allowed to come in. From the wooden pin tumblers of the Egyptians to the mechanical puzzles of the Byzantines, every single culture had added its own unique layer to the story. Each key that they had created had held a certain power, not just a practical one, but also a psychological one. To possess a key was to hold a sense of authority, of access, and often of secrecy. The locks of the time could tell you who it was that ruled the house, who it was that controlled the grain, and who it was that had the right to be able to touch the sacred scroll, to be able to open the holy shrine, or to be able to enter the ancient tomb. And as the technology of the time had advanced, so too did the theatrics of protection. There were false keyholes, there were hidden compartments, and there were locks that were shaped like lions or that were wrapped in intricate inscriptions. These were not just meant to be forms of defense, they were also meant to be messages. They would say, "I am valuable, I am protected, and I know something that you do not." What is even more fascinating is how the use of locks was both shaped by, and in turn had also shaped human behavior. In cultures that had valued a sense of hierarchy, the locks would be used to reinforce the existing boundaries. In societies that had had a more fluid sense of trade and that had more diverse populations, they would be used to protect the marketplaces, the homes, and the temples from any sense of mistrust and from any acts of theft. And in the religious systems of the time, they would be used to safeguard the sacred, not just from other humans, but also from the impure, from the unworthy, and from the uninitiated. And then, of course, there is the paradox of it all. The more advanced that the locks had become, the more that the lockpickers had followed. Just as every single civilization had developed a better sense of security, there were always others who had learned how to be able to bypass it. The same cat and mouse game that we still know of today had first started thousands of years ago, in a Mesopotamian grain vault or in a Roman merchant's chest. Ultimately, the ancient locks are able to offer us more than just a glimpse into the world of engineering. They are also able to give us a deep insight into the human condition itself. Our desire for safety, our tendency towards suspicion, our need to be able to draw a line between the public and the private, and our relentless drive to be able to protect the things that we value the most. Because even in the ancient world, a locked door was not just a barrier. It was a declaration, a quiet and an enduring whisper that said, "This matters, this is mine, and only I am the one who may be able to open it."